her. Light, but she had long lashes. She ignored Eginin as if the other woman did not exist, and in truth, Eginin was doing her best to appear part of a cabinet built into the wall. So much for hoping for a diversion. Toy doesn't mean to be rude, Tuan murmured in a drawl. He just has never been trained in manners. But it is late, Master Charin. Time for Oliver to be in bed. Perhaps you will escort him to his tent? We'll play again another time, Oliver. Would you like me to teach you to play stones? Oliver most definitely would. He almost wriggled, saying so. The boy liked anything that gave him a chance to smile, not to mention a chance to say things that should have gotten him slapped till his ears had swelled up bigger than they already were. If Matt ever found out which of his uncles was teaching him that. But the lad gathered the pieces of his game and carefully rolled up the line-marked cloth without a second urging. He even made a very good leg, thanking the high lady before letting Noel lead him from the wagon. Matt nodded approvingly. He had talked about the leg, but the boy usually added a leer for a pretty woman. If he ever found out who. You have a reason for interrupting me, Toy? No! Duan said in cool tones. It is late, and I was thinking of going to sleep. He made a leg and gave her his best smile. He could be polite even if she was not. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. These wagons are uncomfortable on the road. And I know you aren't happy with the clothes I could find you. I thought this might make you feel a little better. Fishing a leather bag from his pocket, he presented it with a flourish. Women always liked. You aren't happy with the clothes I could find you. I thought this might make you feel a little better. Fishing a leather bag from his pocket, he presented it with a flourish. Women always liked that little extra flourish. Selucia tensed, blue eyes sharpening, but Tuan waggled her slim fingers, and the bosomy maid subsided. A little. Matt liked feisty women by and large, but if she ruined this, he was going to paddle her bottom. He hung on to his smile with an effort, and even managed to ratchet it up a notch. Tuan turned the bag over her hands several times before untying the drawstrings and spilling what it contained into her lap. A heavy necklace of gold and carved amber. An expensive piece, and Shanchan worked to boot. He was proud of finding the thing. It had been the property of an acrobat who had it from a Shanchan officer whose fancy she caught. But she had been willing to sell now that her officer was left behind. It did not suit her skin, whatever that meant. He smiled and waited. Jewels always softened a woman's heart.
1 second.
No one's reaction was quite what he expected, though. Tuan lifted the necklace in front of her face with both hands, studying it as if she had never seen such a thing before. Selucia's lip curled in a sneer. Satala set her embroidery down on her knees and looked at him, the large golden hoops in her ears swaying as she shook her head. Abruptly, Tuan thrust the necklace back over her shoulder toward Selucia. It does not suit me, she said. Would you like it, Selucia? Matt's smile slipped a little. The cream-skinned woman took the necklace between thumb and forefinger, as if holding a dead rat by the tail. A piece for a shade dancer to wear with her veil, she said wryly. With a twist of her wrist, she hurled the necklace at Eginin, saying, Put it on. Eginin caught the thing just before it hit her face. Matt's smile slid the rest of the way off his. He expected an explosion, but Eginin immediately fumbled open the clasp and pushed her heavy wig back to fasten it behind her neck.
Hey, Panda Cat, how you doing, bro?
Snow for all the expression on it. Turn.
Hope you're doing well.
Commanded, and it was a command, without any doubt. Let me see. Eginin turned. Stiff as a fence post, but she turned. Satala looked at her intently, with a puzzled shake of her head. Then he gave Matt a different head shake before returning to her embroidery. Women had as many ways of shaking their heads as they had looks. This one said he was a fool, and if he did not catch the finer nuances, he was just as glad. He did not think he would have liked them. Burn him, he bought a necklace for Tuan, and gave it to Selucia right in front of him, and now it was Eginin's? She came for a new name, Tuan said musingly. What do you call yourself? Lyle Wynn, Solutia replied. A fitting name for a shade dancer. Lyle Wynn Shipless, perhaps. Tuan nodded. Lyle Wynn Shipless. Eginin jerked as though every word was a slap.
Hell yeah, Panda Cat.
May I
Definitely
withdraw?
appreciate it.
She asked.
You might take a dab now.
In sharp bow. If you want to go, then go, Matt growled. Bringing her in the first place had not been the best notion he ever had, but maybe he could recover a little without her. Eyes locked on the floorboards, Eginin sank to her knees. Please, may I withdraw? Tuan sat there straight-backed on the floor, staring through the taller woman, clearly not seeing her at all. Solutia eyed Eginin up and down, pursing her lips. Satala pushed her needle through the cloth stretched on her hoop. No one so much as glanced at Matt. Eginin dropped to her face, and Matt bit back a startled oath when she kissed the floor. Please, she said hoarsely, I beg leave to withdraw. You will go, Lyle Wynn, Solutia said, cold as a queen speaking to a chicken thief. And you will not let me see your face again, unless it is covered by a shade dancer's veil. Eginin scrambled backward on hands and knees, and all but tumbled out the door, so fast that Matt was left gaping. With an effort, he managed to regain his smile. There seemed little point in staying, but a man could make a graceful exit. Well, I suppose. Tuan wriggled her fingers again, still not looking at him, and Solutia cut him short. The High Lady is weary, Toy. You have her permission to go. Look, my name is Matt, he said. An easy name. A simple name. Matt. Tuan might as well have been a porcelain doll, in truth, for all the response she made. Satala set down her embroidery, though, and rose with one hand resting lightly on the hilt of the curved dagger stuck behind her belt. Young man, if you think you're going to lounge about till you get to see us readying for bed, you're so mistaken. She smiled, saying it, but she did have her hand on her knife, and she was Ebudari enough to stick a man on a whim. Tuan remained an unmoving doll, a queen on her throne, somehow mistakenly dressed in ill-fitting clothes. Matt left. Egin was leaning on one hand against the side of the wagon, her head hanging. Her other hand was gripping the necklace around her throat. Arnon moved, a little way off in the darkness, just to show he was still there. A wise man to keep clear of Egin just then. Matt was too irritated for wisdom. What was that about? He demanded. You don't have to go on your knees to Tuan anymore. And Solutia? She's a bloody lady's maid. I don't know anybody who'd jump for his queen the way you jump for her. Eginen's hard face was shadowed, but her voice was haggard. The High Lady is who she is. Solutia is her Sojin. No one of the low blood would dare meet her Sojin's eyes, and maybe not the high blood either. The clasp broke with a metallic snap as she jerked the necklace free. But then, I'm not of any blood now. Rearing back, she was throwing the necklace as far as she could. Matt opened his mouth. He could have bought a dozen prime horses with what he paid for that thing and had coin left. He closed it again without saying a word. He might not always be wise, but he was wise enough to know when a woman really might try to stick a knife in him. He knew another thing as well. If Eginen behaved this way around Tuan and Solutia, then he had better make sure the Suldam were kept clear. The light only knew what they would do if Tuan started wiggling her fingers. That left him with a job of work to do. Well, he hated work, but those old memories had his head stuffed full of battles. He hated battle, too. A man could get killed dead, but it was better than work. Strategy and tactics. Learn the ground, learn your enemy. And if you could not win one way, you found another. The next night, he returned to the purple wagon, alone. Once Alder had finished his lesson, Matt into a game. At first, sitting on the floor across the board from the dark little woman, he was not sure whether to win or lose. Some women liked to win every time, but the man had to make her work for it. Some liked the man to win, or at least more often than he lost. It never made any sense to him. He liked to win, and the easier the better. But that was how it was. While he was dithering, Tuan took matters out of his hands. Halfway through the game, he realized she had him in a trap he could not get out of. Her white stones were cutting off his black everywhere. It was a clean and resounding win for her. You don't play very well, Toy, she said mockingly. Despite the tone, her big liquid eyes considered him coolly, weighing and measuring. A man could drown in eyes like that. He smiled and made his goodbyes before there could be any thought of kicking him out. Strategy. Think to the future. Do the unexpected. The next night, he brought a small red paper flower made by one of the show's seamstresses and presented it to a startled Solutia. Satala's eyebrows rose, and even Tuon seemed taken aback. Tactics. Put your opponent off balance. Come to think, women in battles were not that different. Both wrapped a man in fog and could kill him without trying, if he was careless. Every night he visited the Purple Wagon for a game of stones under Satala and Selutia's watchful eyes, and he concentrated on the cross-hatched board. Tuon was very good, and it was all too easy to find himself watching the way she placed her stones, with her fingers bent back in a curiously graceful way. She was used to having fingernails an inch long, and taking care not to break them. Her eyes were a danger, too. You needed a clear head in stones or battle, and her gaze seemed to reach inside his skull. He buckled down to the game, though, and managed to win 4 of the next 7 with 1 draw. Tuon was satisfied when she won and determined when she lost, with none of the temper tantrums he had feared. No scathing comments, aside from insisting on calling him Toy. Not very much of that icy regal hauteur, as long as they were playing anyway. She purely enjoyed the game, laughing exultantly when she pulled him into a trap, laughing in delight when he managed a clever placement to escape. She seemed a different woman once she lost herself in the stones board. A flower sewn from blue linen followed the paper blossom, and 2 days later, a pink silk bloom that spread out as wide as a woman's palm. Both handed to Solutia. Her blue eyes increasingly set in a suspicious frown when they rested on him, but Tuon told her she could keep the flowers, and she stored them away carefully, folded in a linen cloth. He let 3 days pass without a present, then brought a little cluster of red silk rosebuds, complete with short stems and glistening leaves that looked like only more perfect. He had asked the seamstress to make it on the day he bought that first paper flower. Solutia took a step, reaching to accept the rosebuds with a curl to her lip, but he sat down and put the flowers beside the board, a little toward Tuon. He said nothing, just laughed. She never so much as glanced, dipping into the small leather bags that held the stones. Shuffled them between his hands to leave an even there, then offered his closed hand. Tuon hesitated a moment, in his face with no expression. He opened it to display the glistening white stone. I've changed my mind, Toy, she murmured, placing the white stone carefully on the intersection of 2 lines near the center of the board. You play very well. Matt blinked. Could she know what he was up to? Solutia was standing at Tuon's back, seemingly absorbed in the empty board. Satala turned a page and shifted a little to get a better light. Of course not. She was talking about stones. If she even suspected his real game, she would toss him out on his ear. Any woman would. It had to be the stones. That was the night they played to a draw, with each of them controlling half the board in irregular pools and patches. In truth, she won a victory. I have kept my word, Toy, she drawled as he was replacing the stones in the bags. No attempts to escape. No attempts at betrayal. This is confining. She gestured around at the interior of the wagon. I wish to take walks. After dark will do. You may accompany me. Her eyes touched the cluster of rosebuds, then rose to his face. To make sure I don't run away. Satala marked her place with a slim finger and looked at him. Solutia stood behind Tuon and looked at him. The woman had kept her word, mad as that seemed. Walks after dark, with most of the showfolk already in their beds, would do no harm. Not with him there to make sure. So why did he feel that he was losing control of the situation? Tuon agreed to go cloaked and hooded, which was something of a relief. The black hair was growing back in on her shaved scalp, but so far it was little more than long fuzz. Unlike Solutia, who very likely slept in her headscarf, Tuon had shown no inclination to cover her head. A child-sized woman, any man going bald, would have been remarked even in the night. Satala and Solutia always followed at a little distance in the darkness, the lady's maid to keep a protective eye on her mistress, and Satala to keep an eye on the maid. At least, he thought that was how it was. Sometimes it seemed they were both watching him. The two of them were awfully friendly for guard and prisoner. He had overheard Satala cautioning Solutia that he was a rogue with women, a fine thing for her to be saying. And Solutia had calmly replied that her lady would break his arms if he showed any disrespect, just as if they were not prisoners at all. He thought to use these walks to learn a little more about Tuan. She did not talk much over a stone's board, but she had a way of ignoring what he asked or deflecting the subject, usually to him. The two rivers is all forests and farms, he said as they strolled along the main street of the show. Clouds hid the moon. The colorful wagons were indistinguishable dark shapes, the performers' platforms lining the street merely shadows.
1 second.
Everybody grows tobacco and raises sheep. My father breeds cows, too, and trades horses. But mostly it's tobacco and sheep from one end to the other. Your father trades horses, Tuan murmured. And what do you do, Toy? He glanced over his shoulder at the two women ghosting along 10 paces back. Satala might have been here if he kept his voice down, but he decided to be honest. Besides, the show was dead quiet in the darkness. She might hear, and she knew what he had been doing in Abu Dar. I'm a gambler, he said. My father called himself a gambler, Tuan said softly. He died of a bad wager. And how were you supposed to find out what that meant? Another night, walking along a row of animal cages, each one built to fill an entire wagon, he said, What do you do for fun, Tuan? Just because you enjoy it, aside from playing stones. He could almost feel Solutia bristling at his use of her name from 30 feet away, but Tuan did not seem to mind. He thought she did not. I train horses and damani, she said, peering into a cage that held a sleeping lion. The animal was only a large shadow, lying on the straw behind the thick bars. Does he really have a black mane? There are no lions with black manes in all of Shanjiang. She trained damani for fun? Light. Horses? What kind of horses? It might be war horses if she trained bloody damani for fun. Mistress Anand tells me you're a scoundrel, Toy. Her voice was cool, not cold, composed. She turned toward him, face hidden in the shadows of her cowl. How many women have you kissed? The lion woke up and coughed, a deep sound guaranteed to raise the hair on anyone's head. Tuan did not even flinch. Looks like rain's coming again, he said weakly. Solutia will have my mind soaked. He heard her laugh softly. What had he said that was funny? There was a price to pay, of course. Maybe things were going his way and maybe not, but when you thought they were, there was always a price. Bunch of chattering magpies, he complained to Agina. The afternoon sat on the horizon, a red gold ball half hidden by clouds, casting the show in long shadows. There was no rain for once, and in spite of the cold, they were sitting hunched beneath the green wagon they shared, playing stones in plain sight of anyone who walked by. A good many did, men hurrying about some last-minute chore, children snatching the final chance to roll hoops through the mud puddles and toss balls before night fell. Women holding their skirts up glanced at the wagon in passing, and even when they were hooded, Matt knew what their expressions were. Hardly a woman in the show would speak to Matt Coffin. Irritably, he rattled the black stones he held gathered in his left hand. They'll get their gold when we reach Lugard. That's all they ought to care about. They shouldn't be poking their noses into my business. You can hardly blame them, Agina drawled, studying the board. You and I are supposed to be fleeing lovers, but you spend more time with her than with me. She still had trouble not calling Tuan High Lady. You behave like a man courting. She reached to place her stone, then stopped with her hand above the board. You can't think she'll complete the ceremony, can you? You can't be that big a fool. What ceremony? What are you talking about? You named her your wife 3 times that night in Abu Dar, she said slowly. You really don't know? A woman says 3 times that a man is her husband, and he says 3 times she's his wife. And they're married. There are blessings involved, usually, but it's saying it in front of witnesses that makes it a marriage. You really didn't know? Matt laughed and shrugged his shoulders, feeling the knife hanging behind his neck. A good knife gave a man a feeling of comfort, but his laugh was hoarse. But she didn't say anything. He had bloody well been stuffing a gag in her mouth at the time. So whatever I said, it doesn't mean anything. But he knew what Egin was going to say. Sure as water was wet, he knew. He had been told who he was going to marry. With the blood, it's a little different. Sometimes a noble from one end of the empire marries a noble from the other. An arranged marriage. The imperial family never has any other kind. They may not want to wait until they can be together, so one acknowledges the marriage where she is, and the other where he is. As long as they both speak in front of witnesses, inside a year and a day, the marriage is legal. You truly didn't know? Sure were sure. But the stones still spilled from his hand onto the board, bouncing everywhere. The bloody girl knew. Maybe she thought this whole thing was an adventure, or a game. Maybe she thought being kidnapped was as much fun as training horses or bloody Damani. But he knew he was a trout, waiting for her to set the hook. He stayed away from the purple wagon for 2 days. There was no use running. He already had the bloody hook in his mouth, and he had put it there himself. But he did not have to swallow the flaming thing. Only, he knew it was just a matter of when she decided to jerk it tight. As slowly as the show moved, eventually they reached the ferry across the Eldar, running from Alkindar on the west bank to Koromin on the east. Tidy little walled towns of tile-roofed buildings with half a dozen stone docks each. The sun was climbing high, hardly a cloud crossed the sky, and those white as new-washed wool. No rain today, maybe. It was an important crossing, with trading ships from upriver tied to some of the docks and big barge-like ferries crawling from one town to the other on long sweeps. The Shonchan apparently thought so too. They had military camps outside both towns, and from the stone walls beginning to rise around the camps and the stone structures going up inside, they had no intention of leaving soon. Matt crossed over with the first wagons, riding Pips. The brown gelding looked ordinary enough to an undiscerning eye. It did not seem out of place for him to be ridden by a fellow in a rough woolen coat with a woolen cap pulled down over his ears against the cold. He was not actually considering making a run for the hilly wooded ridge country behind Koromin. Thinking about it, but not really considering. She was going to set the hook whether he ran or not. So he sat Pips at the end of one of the stone ferry landings, watching the show cross over and trundle away through the town. There were Shonchan on the landings, a squad of beefy men in segmented armor, painted blue and burnt gold under a lean young officer with one thin blue plume on his odd-looking helmet. They seemed to be there just to keep order, but the officer checked Luca's horse warrant, and Luca inquired whether the noble lord might know of ground outside the town suitable for his show to perform. Matt could have wept. He could see soldiers wearing striped armor in the street behind him, wandering in and out of shops and taverns. A rocket swooped down out of the sky on long-ribbed wings, alighting outside one of the camps across the river. 3 or 4 of the snake-necked creatures were already on the ground. There had to be hundreds of soldiers in those camps, maybe 1,000. And Luca was going to put on his show. Then one of the ferries hit the rope-padded bumpers at the end of the landing, and the ramp came down to let the windowless purple wagon rumble off onto the stones. Satala was driving, so Lucia sat on one side of her, peering out from the hood of a faded red cloak. On the other side, swathed in a dark cloak, so not an inch of her showed, was Tuon. Matt thought his eyes were going to fall out of his head, if his heart did not pound its way out of his chest first. The dice had started up in his head, that rattling feel of dice rolling across a table. They were going to come up the Dark One's eyes this time. He just knew it. There was nothing to do except fall in beside the purple wagon, though, riding along as though life were wonderful, riding along the wide main street through criers for shops and hawkers selling things from trays. And Shonchan soldiers. They were not marching in formation now, and they eyed the brightly painted wagons with interest, riding along, waiting for Tuon to shout. She had given her word, but a prisoner would say anything to get the shackles loosened. All she had to do was raise her voice and summon 1,000 Shonchan soldiers for rescue. The dice bounced and spun in Matt's head. Riding along, waiting for the Dark One's eyes. Tuon never spoke a word. She peeked curiously past the edge of her deep cowl. Curiously and cautiously, but she kept her face hidden, and even her hands, all wrapped in that dark cloak, and even huddling against Satala like a child seeking the protection of her mother in a strange crowd. Never a word until they had passed the gates of Corman and were rumbling toward the base of the ridge that rose behind the town, where Luca was already gathering the show's wagons. That was when Matt really knew there was no escape for him. She was going to set the hook all right. She was just biding her bloody time. He made sure all the Shongshan stayed in their wagons that night, and the Aes Sedai, too. Nobody had seen any Suldam or Damani that Matt knew, but the Aes Sedai did not argue for once. Tuan did not argue either. She made a demand that sent Satala's eyebrows almost to her hairline. It was phrased as a request, in a way a reminder of a promise he had made. But he knew a demand when a woman made one. Well, the man had to trust the woman he was going to marry. He told her he had to think on it, just so she would not start imagining she could have anything she wanted out of him. He thought on it all the day that Luca put on his show, thinking and sweating while as many Shongshan as not came to gape at the performers. He thought on it while the wagons wound eastward through the hills, moving slower than ever, but he knew what answer he had to give. On the third day after leaving the river, they reached the salt town of Jurador, and he told Tuan that he would. She smiled at him, and the dice in his head stopped dead. He would always remember that. She smiled, and then the dice stopped. A man could weep. Chapter 29. Something flickers. "This do be madness," Doman rumbled from where he stood with his arms folded as if blocking the way out of the wagon. Maybe he was. His jaw was thrust forward belligerently, sticking out a beard that was trimmed short, but still longer than the hair on his head, and he was working his hands like a man thinking of making fists, or grappling with something. A wide man, Doman, and not as fat as he looked on first glance. Matt wanted to avoid fists or grappling, if he could. He finished tying the black silk scarf around his neck, hiding his scar, and tucked the long ends into his coat. The chance that there was anyone in Jurador who knew about a man in Abu Dar wearing a black scarf, well, the odds seemed good, even discounting his luck. Of course, there was always his being Taviran to be factored in, but if that was going to bring him face to face with Suroth, or a fistful of servants from the Terrasin Palace, he could stay in bed with a blanket wrapped around his head, and it still would happen. Sometimes you just had to trust to luck. The trouble was, when he woke this morning, the dice had again been tumbling in his head. They were bouncing off the inside of his skull still. "I promised," he said. It was good to be back in decent clothes. The coat was a fine green wool, well cut and hanging almost to his knees in the turned-down tops of his boots. There was no embroidery. Maybe it could do with a little. But he had a touch of lace at his cuffs. And a good silk shirt. He wished he had a mirror. A man needed to look his best on a day like this. Picking up his cloak from the bed, he swung it across his shoulders. Not a gaudy thing like Luca's. Dark gray, nearly as dark as night. Only the lining was red. His cloak pin was simple silver knots, no larger than his thumbs. "She gave her word, Bale," Eginin said. "Her word. She will not break that, ever." Eginin sounded absolutely convinced. More convinced than Matt was, anyway. But sometimes a man had to take a chance, even if he was wagering his neck. He had promised. And he did have his luck. "It'd still be madness," Doman grumbled. But he moved grudgingly away from the door when Matt settled his broad-brimmed black hat on his head. Well, when Eginin motioned him aside with a quick jerk of her head, anyway. He kept his glower, though. She followed Matt out of the wagon, scowling herself and fiddling with her long black wig. Maybe she still felt uneasy with it. Or maybe it fit differently now that she had close to a month's growth of her own hair underneath. Not enough to go about bareheaded yet, in any case. Not till there was at least another 100 miles between them and Abu Dar. Maybe it would not be safe until they crossed the Damona Mountains into Murundi. The sky was clear, the sun just cresting the horizon, invisible yet behind the show's canvas wall, and the morning was warm only compared to a snowstorm. Not the crispness of a late winter morning in the Two Rivers, but a chill that slowly bored deep and put a faint mist in your breath. The showfolk were scurrying about like ants in a kicked anthill, filling the air with shouted demands to know who had moved those juggling rings or borrowed that pair of red-spangled breeches or shifted this performing platform. It looked and sounded like the start of a riot, yet there was no real anger in any of the voices. They shouted and waved arms all the time, but it never came to blows when there was a show in the offing, and somehow every performer would be in place and ready before the first patrons were let in. They might be slow packing up for the road, but performing meant money, and they could move fast enough for that. "You really do think you can marry her?" Aginin muttered, striding along at his side, kicking her worn brown woolen skirts. There was nothing dainty about Aginin. She had a long stride, and she kept up easily. Dress or no dress, she seemed to need a sword on her hip. "There's no other explanation for this. Bale is right. You are mad." Matt grinned. "The question is, does she mean to marry me? The strangest people marry sometimes." When you knew you were going to hang, the only thing to do was grin at the noose. So he grinned and left her standing there with a scowl on her hard face. He thought she was growling curses under her breath, though he did not understand why. She was not the one who had to marry the last person on earth she wanted to. A noble woman, all cool reserve and her nose in the air, when he liked barmaids with ready smiles and willing eyes. The heir to a throne, and not just any throne. The crystal throne, the imperial throne of Shonchan. A woman who spun his head like a top and left him wondering whether he held her captive or she held him. When fate gripped you by the throat, there was nothing to do but grin. He kept a jaunty pace till he was inside of the windowless purple wagon, and then he missed a step. A cluster of acrobats, 4 limber men who called themselves the Chabana brothers, though it was plain as their noses they came from different countries, not just different mothers, rushed out of a green wagon nearby, shouting and gesturing wildly at one another. They spared a glance for the purple wagon and another for Matt, but they were too engrossed in their argument and trotting too fast for more. Gorderon was leaning against one of the purple wheels, scratching his head and frowning at the 2 women who stood at the foot of the wagon's wooden steps. 2 women, both swathed in dark cloaks, faces concealed, yet there was no mistaking the flowered headscarf hanging out of the taller woman's cowl. Well, he should have known Tuan would want her maid along. Noble women never went anywhere without a maid. Bet a penny or bet a crown, in the end it all came down to a toss of the dice just the same. They had had their chance to betray him. Still, he was betting on a woman making the same choice twice running. On 2 women doing it. What fool would make odds on that? But he had to toss the dice. Except they were already rolling. He met Selucia's cold blue stare with a smile and swept off his hat to make an elegant leg to Tuan. Not too showy, with just a small flourish of his cloak. "Are you ready to go shopping?" He very nearly called her Milady, but until she was willing to say his name. "I have been ready for an hour, Toy," Tuan drawled coolly. Casually lifting an edge of his cloak, she glanced at the red silk lining and eyed his coat before letting the cloak fall. "Lace suits you.
1 second, I want to
Perhaps
be
have
right
lace
back.
added to your robes if I make you a bearer." His smile slipped for an instant. Could she still make him Daco Vale if she married him? He would have to ask Aginin. Light, why did women never make it easy? "Do you want me to come along, my lord?" Gorderon asked slowly, not quite looking at the women now. He tucked his thumbs behind his belt and did not quite look at Matt either. "Just carry, maybe?" Tuan did not say a word. She just stood there looking up at Matt, waiting, big eyes getting cooler by the second. The dice bounced and rattled in his head. Well, he only hesitated a heartbeat before jerking his head to send the red arm away. Maybe 2 heartbeats. He had to trust his luck, trust her word. Trust is the sound of death. He stepped on that thought hard. This was no song, and no old memory could guide him. The dice inside his skull kept spinning. With a slight bow, he offered his arm, which Tuan examined as if she had never seen an arm before, pursing those full lips. Then she gathered her cloak and set off with Selucia gliding at her heels, leaving him to hurry after them. No, women never did make it easy. Despite the early hour, 2 burly fellows with cudgels were already guarding the entrance, and a third, with a clear glass pitcher to take the coins and dump them through a slot in the iron-strapped box on the ground. Each of the 3 looked too clumsy to palm a copper without falling on his face, but Luca took no chances. 20 or 30 people were already waiting inside the heavy ropes that led to the big blue banner naming Luca's show, and unfortunately, Littell was there too, stern-faced in a dress sewn with crimson spangles, and a cloak sewn with blue. Luca's wife trained bears. Matt thought the bears did their tricks for fear she might bite them. I have everything in hand, he told her. Believe me, there's nothing to worry about. He might as well have spared his breath. Littell ignored him, frowning worriedly at Tuon and Selucia. She and her husband were the only two showfolk who knew who they were. There had seemed no reason to tell either about this morning's jaunt. Luca, at least, would have had kittens. The stare Littell shifted to Matt was not worried, just stone hard. Remember, she said quietly, if you send us to the gallows, you send yourself. Then she sniffed and went back to studying the people waiting to get in. Littell was even more than Luca at judging the weight of a purse before the drawstrings were undone. She was also 10 times tougher than her husband. The dice tumbled on. Whatever had set them spinning, he had not yet reached the fateful point, the deciding point. She is a good wife for Master Luca, Tuon murmured when they had gone a little way. Matt looked at her sideways and resettled his hat on his head. There had been no mockery in her tone. Did she hate Luca that much? Or was she saying what sort of wife she would be? Or, burn him, he could go as crazy as Dillman thought he was, trying to puzzle this woman out. She had to be the reason for the feel of the dice in his head. What was she going to do? It was a short walk away from the rising sun to the town, along a hard-packed road through hills that were treeless here, but people dotted the road the way windmills and salt pans dotted the hills. Staring straight ahead, they moved so purposefully, they seemed not to see anyone in front of them. Matt dodged a round-faced man and nearly walked right into him, which made him have to jump away from a white-haired old fellow, making a good speed on spindly legs. That put him in front of a plump girl who would have run up the front of him if he had not jumped again. Are you practicing a dance, Toy? Tuon said, peering up at him over a slim shoulder. Her breath made a faint white mist in front of her cowl. It isn't very graceful. He opened his mouth just to point out how crowded the road was, and suddenly he realized he could no longer see anyone beyond her and Selucia. The people who had been there were just gone, the road empty as far as he could see before it made a bend. Slowly he turned his head. There was no one between him and the show either, just the folk waiting in line, and that looked no longer than before. Beyond the show, the road wound into the hills toward a distant forest, empty. Not a soul in sight. He pressed fingers against his chest, feeling the fox-head medallion through his coat. A piece of silver on a rawhide cord. He wished it felt cold as ice. Tuon arched an eyebrow. Selucia's stare named him fool. I can't buy you a dress standing here, he said. That was the point of this expedition, his promise to find Tuon something better than dresses that hung on her and made her look like a child in grown-up's clothing. At least he was pretty sure he had promised that, and she was perfectly certain. The needlework of the show's seamstresses met with Tuon's approval, but not the cloth they had available. Performers' costumes glittered with spangles and beads in bright colors, but the cloth was usually whatever could be found cheaply. Those who had better kept it and used it till it wore out. Jurador made its money from salt, though, and salt made a great deal of money. The town's shops should offer any sort of material a woman could wish. There was no finger-wiggling this time. Tuon shared a look with Selucia. The taller woman shook her head, a wry, rueful twist to her mouth. Tuon shook her head. And they gathered their cloaks and started toward the town's iron-studded gates. Women. He hurried to catch up again. They were his prisoners, after all. They were. Their shadows stretched out long in front of them. Had any of those people cast shadows before they vanished? He could not recall any of them breathing a mist, either. It hardly seemed to matter. They were gone, and he was not going to think about where they had come from or where they had gone. Probably something to do with being ta'veren. He was going to put it out of his head. He was. The dice rattling away left room for nothing else. The gate guards seemed incurious about strangers, or at least about a man and two women afoot. Hard-faced fellows in white-painted breastplates and conical helmets with what looked like horse tails for crests. They ran impassive eyes over the cloaked women, lingering suspiciously a moment on Matt for some reason, and then returned to leaning on their halberds and staring blankly at the road. They were local men, most likely, in any case, not Seanchan. The salt merchants and the local lady, Ethelin, who apparently said whatever the salt merchants told her to, had sworn the oaths of return without hesitation, and offered to pay a salt tax before they were asked. No doubt the Seanchan would get around to installing some sort of official here eventually, just to keep an eye on everything, but for the moment, They had more important uses for their soldiers. Matt had sent Tom and Julian both to make sure there were no Seanchan in Jurador before agreeing to this excursion. A fool could trip over his own luck if he was not careful. It was a prosperous, busy town, Jurador, with stone-paved streets, most of them wide and all lined with stone buildings roofed in reddish tiles. Houses and inns rubbed shoulders with stables and taverns, in a noisy jumble with a blacksmith's clanging hammer on an anvil here, and the racketing of a rug-weaver's looms there, and everywhere, it seemed, coopers hammering bands on tight barrels for transporting salt. Hawkers cried pins and ribbons, meat pies and roasted nuts from trays, or winter-wrinkled turnips and sorry plums from barrows. On every street, men and women stood guard over the display goods on narrow tables in front of their shops, and bellowed lists of what was offered within. Picking out the salt merchants' houses was easy, though. 3 stories of stone rather than 2, covering 8 times as much ground as any others, each with a columned walk overlooking the street and shielded by white wrought-iron screens between the columns. The lower windows on most houses had those screens, though not always painted. That much was reminiscent of Abu Dar, but little else was, beyond the olive complexions of the people. There were no deep necklines exposing cleavage here, no skirts sewn up to display colored petticoats. The women wore embroidered dresses with high necks right up to their chins. A little embroidery for the common folk, a great deal for the richer, who wore cloaks embroidered top to bottom and sheer veils hanging over their faces from combs of gold work or carved ivory stuck into dark, coiled braids. The men's short coats were worked almost as thickly in colors just as bright, and rich or poor, most men wore a long belt knife with a blade a little less curved than those in Abu Dar. Rich or poor, the fellows did have a tendency to fondle their knife hilts as if expecting a fight, so maybe that was the same. The Lady Ethelana's palace appeared no different from the outside than the salt merchants' mansions, but it was located in the town's main square, a wide expanse of polished stone, where a broad, round marble fountain sprayed water into the air. People filled their buckets and big pottery water jars from pipes spilling into stone basins at the corners of other squares, though. The big fountain put out a smell of brine. It was a symbol of Jurador's wealth, pumped from the same source as the salt wells in the surrounding hills. Matt got to see a good deal of the town before the sun climbed even halfway to its noon peak. Every time Tuon and Selucia spotted a shop with silks displayed out front, they stopped at the long, narrow table to feel bolts of cloth and whisper with their heads together, waving off the attentions of the watchful shopkeeper. Those kept a very watchful eye until they realized Matt was with the 2 women. In their stout woolens, well worn and badly fitting, they did not look like customers for silk. Matt, with one side of his cloak thrown back to expose the lining, did. Whenever he tried to show an interest, though, women said they wanted you to show an interest. Whenever he got close enough to hear what they were saying, the women fell silent and looked at him, cool dark eyes and cool blue staring out of their deep cowls, until he fell back a step or 2. Then Selucia would bend her head to Tuon's, and they would go back to murmuring and fingering silk, red silk, blue silk, green silk, smooth, shimmering silk, and brocaded silk. Jurador was a very wealthy town. Luckily, he had tucked a fat purse of gold into his coat pocket. None of it seemed to be right, though. Inevitably, Tuon shook her head, and the pair of them glided away into the crowd, with Matt hurrying to keep up as far as the next shop, showing silks. The dice continued to bounce off the inside of his skull. They were not the only ones from the show who had come into the town. He spotted Erludra, her face framed by beaded braids, walking through the crowd with a gray-haired man who tried to be a salt merchant from the amount of bright embroidery covering his silk coat in flowers and hummingbirds. What would the illuminator want with a salt merchant? Whatever she was saying to him, his pleased smile had added a few creases to his face, and he was nodding. Tuon shook her head, and the 2 women glided toward the next shop, ignoring the shopkeeper's deep bows. Well, most of those were directed at Matt. Maybe the skinny fool thought he wanted to buy silk for himself. Not that he would have passed up a new silk coat or 3, but who could think about coats when he was waiting for those bloody dice to stop? Just a little embroidery on the sleeves and shoulders. Tom went by, clutching his bronze-colored cloak around him, knuckling his long white mustaches and yawning as if he had spent the night awake. He might have. The Gleeman had not taken to drink again, but Lopen and Narim complained about him remaining awake till all hours, burning a lamp so he could read and reread his precious letter. What could be so fascinating in a letter from a dead woman? A dead woman. Like, maybe there's people on the road? No. He was not going to think about that at all. Tuon plucked one fold of silk and let it drop as she turned away without trying another. Solutia gave the stout shopkeeper such a stare before following that the woman started back in her front. Matt offered her a smile. Affronted shopkeepers could lead to town guards asking questions, and who could say where that might lead? He knew he could smile most women into feeling soothed. The round-faced woman sniffed at him and bent to smoothing the bolt of silk as tenderly as tucking in a babe. Most women, he thought sourly. Down the street, a woman in a plain cloak let her hood fall back, and Matt's breath caught in his throat. Edicina lifted her cowl again, but she took no hurry with it. The damage was done anyway, and Aes Sedai's ageless face displayed for anyone who knew what they were seeing. No one in the street gave a sign that they had noticed anything, but he could not see every face. Was anyone thinking of a reward? There might be no Seanchan in Jorador at the moment, but they did pass through. Edicina glided around a corner. Two dark-cloaked shapes followed her. Two. Had the Sultan left only one of their number in the camp to watch two Aes Sedai? Or maybe Jolene or Teslin was somewhere close by, and he had missed seeing her. He craned his neck, searching the throng for another plain cloak, but everyone he saw had at least a little embroidery. Abruptly, it hit him like a stone between the eyes. Every cloak he could see had at least a little embroidery. Where were bloody Tuon and bloody Solutia? Were the dice spinning faster? Breathing hard, he went up on his toes, where the street was a river of embroidered cloaks, embroidered coats and dresses. It did not mean they were trying to escape. Tuon had given her word. She had passed up a perfect chance for betrayal. But all either woman had to do was say 3 words, and anyone who heard them likely would recognize the Seanchan accent. That might be sufficient to set the hounds on his trail. There were 2 shops ahead that seemed to be offering cloth, one on either side of the street. Neither with a pair of dark-cloaked women at the tables out front. They could have turned a corner easily enough, but he had to trust to luck. His luck was especially good when the game was random. Bloody women probably thought it was a bloody game. Burnham let his luck run good. Closing his eyes, he spun in a circle in the middle of the street and took a step. At random. He bumped into someone solid, hard enough to make them both grunt. A bulky fellow with a small mouth, and a little poorly done scrollwork on the shoulders of his rough coat, stood glaring at him when he opened his eyes, glaring and fingering the hilt of his curved knife. Matt did not care. He was facing straight at one of the 2 shops. Pulling his hat down tight, he ran. The dice were rolling faster. Divided shelves stuffed with bolts of cloth lined the walls of the shop from floor to ceiling, and more stood stacked on long tables out on the floor. The shopkeeper was a scrawny woman with a large mole on her chin, her assistant slim and pretty and angry-eyed. He dashed inside just in time to hear the shopkeeper say, "For the last time, if you won't tell me what you're here for, I'm going to send Nelsa for the guards." Tuon and Solutia, faces still hidden in their hoods, were walking slowly along one wall full of cloth, stopping to touch a bolt, but neither paying the shopkeeper any heed. "They're with me," Matt said breathlessly. Tugging the purse from his pocket, he tossed it on the nearest clear table. The heavy click it made landing put a wide smile on the shopkeeper's narrow face. "Give them whatever they want," he told her. And to Tuon, he added firmly, "If you're going to buy anything, it's going to be here. I've had all the exercise I care for this morning." He would have had the words back as soon as they left his mouth, if he could. Speak to a woman that way, and she flared in your face like one of Eludra's fire sticks every time. But Tuon's big eyes looked up at him from the shelter of her hood, and her full mouth curved slightly in a smile. It was a secret smile, for herself, not him. The light only knew what it meant. He hated it when women did that. At least the dice had not stopped. That had to be a good sign, right? Tuon had no need of words to make her choices, silently pointing out bolt after bolt and measuring with her small dark hands how much the shopkeeper was to cut off with her shears. The woman did the work herself, instead of delegating it to her assistant, and well she might, considering. Red silk in several shades went under those long, sharp scissors, and green silk in a few shades, and more varieties of blue silk than Matt knew existed. Tuon chose out some fine linen in several thicknesses, and lengths of bright wool. She consulted Solutia over those in muffled whispers, but mostly it was silk. He got back much less of his purse than he had expected. Once all that cloth had been folded and neatly tied, then bundled into a larger length of coarse linen, at no extra charge, thank you very much, it made a mound as fat as a peddler's pack. It did not surprise him at all to learn that he was expected to carry the thing across his shoulders with his hat dangling in one hand. Dress your best, buy a woman's silk, and she still found a way to make you work. He earned plenty of stares from gaping fools as he made his way out of the town behind the two women. They glided along smug as cats full of cream. Even cloaked and hooded, their backs said it all. The sun was still well short of midday, with the line of people waiting to get into the show stretched down the road almost to the town. Most gaped and pointed as if he were a painted fool. One of the big horse handlers guarding the coin box gave a gap-toothed smirk and opened his mouth, but Matt returned him a level look, and the fellow decided to put his eyes back on the coins going from townsfolk to glass pitcher to box. Matt thought he had never been so relieved to be inside Luca's show. Before he and the two women had gotten 3 steps inside the entrance, Julian came running up, for a wonder without Thera or his red cap. The thief-catcher's face could have been carved from ancient oak. Eyeing the people flowing past them into the show, he pitched his voice low and urgent. I was coming to find you. It's Guinan. She's been hurt. Come quickly. The man's tone said enough, but worse, Matt realized the dice in his head were drumming now. He flung the pack of cloth at the horse handlers with a hasty injunction to guard it as close as the coin box, or he would set the women on them. But he did not wait to see whether they took him seriously. Julian darted back the way he had come at a run, and Matt ran after him, along the wide main street of the show, where noisy, gawking crowds were watching the 4 bare-chested Giovanna brothers stand on one another's shoulders, and contortionists in filmy trousers and glittering vests sit on their own heads, and a slack rope walker in spangled blue breeches climbing a long wooden ladder to begin her performance. Short of the slack rope walker, Julian dodged into one of the narrower streets, where laundry hung from lines between the tents and wagons. Performers sat on stools and wagon steps waiting to go on, and show children ran playing with balls and hoops. Matt knew where they were headed now, but the thief-catcher ran too fast to overtake. Ahead he saw his green wagon. Littell was peering underneath, and Luca, in one of his bright red cloaks, was waving a pair of jugglers to move along. The two women, in baggy trousers and with faces painted white, like a noble's fools, took a good look under the wagon before they obeyed. As he came closer, he could see what they had been staring at. Coatless, Doman was sitting on the ground under the edge of the wagon, cradling a limp Aeginin in his arms. Her eyes were closed, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Her wig hung askew. That stood out for some reason. She always fussed so to keep that wig straight. The dice beat like thunder.
This could be disaster,
Luca growled, splitting his glower between Matt and Julian. It was an angry glower, though, not frightened.
You may have brought me to disaster.
He shooed away a gaggle of wide-eyed children and growled at a plump woman in skirts that glittered with silvery spangles. Leora made leopards do tricks that even Latella would not try, but she merely tossed her head before gliding off. No one took Luca as seriously as he took himself. The man gave a start when Tuan and Selucia hurried up, and looked on the point of telling them to go too, before he thought better of it. In fact, he began to frown thoughtfully and worriedly. It seemed his wife had not told him about Matt and the women leaving the show. It was clear they had been somewhere. The blue-eyed woman had the huge bundle of cloth on her back now, with her arms doubled behind her, though she stood straight despite the bulk. You would think a lady's maid was used to carrying things. Her face was a picture of frustrated irritation. Littell eyed her up and down, then sneered at Matt as if he were the reason the woman was thrusting her considerable bosom out. Luca's wife was very good at sneering, yet Tuan's stern expression made Littell nearly look mild. A judge peered out of her cowl, a judge ready to pass sentence. For the moment, Matt did not care what the women thought. Those bloody dice. Tossing his cloak back, he went to one knee and touched fingers to Aeginin's throat. Her pulse beat weakly, thin and fluttering. What happened? He asked. Have you sent for one of the sisters? Moving Aeginin might be enough to kill her, but there might be time for healing if the Aes Sedai were quick. He was not about to say that name aloud, though, with people walking by, pausing for curious stares before Luca or Littell hurried them on. Everyone moved quicker for her than for him. Littell herself was the only one who really jumped for Luca. Rena, Doman spat the name. Despite his short cap of hair, that hilly on her beard that left his upper lip bare, he did not look ridiculous now. He looked afraid and murderous, a dangerous combination. I did see her stab Aeginin in the back and run. If I could have reached her, I would have broken her neck, but my hand be all that's holding Aeginin's blood in. Where be that bloody Aes Sedai? He snarled. So much for being careful with his tongue. "I'll be right here, Vale Doman," Teslin announced coldly, rushing up with Thera, who took one horrified look at Tuon and Solution, lashed onto Julian's arm with a squeak, eyes on the ground. The way she began trembling, she might be there herself in a minute. The hard-eyed Aes Sedai made her face as if she had a mouthful of briars when she saw what lay in front of her, or maybe where it lay. But she swiftly crashed underneath the wagon beside Doman and clasped Ginan's head in her bony hands. "Jolene could be better at this than I," she muttered, half under her breath. "I may be able to." The silver fox head went cold against Matt's chest, and Ginan jerked so violently that her wig fell off, nearly pulling herself out of Doman's grasp as her eyes popped open wide. The convulsion lasted only long enough for her to sit halfway up with a frozen gasp. Then she slumped back against Doman's chest, panting. The medallion became just a piece of worked silver again. He was almost accustomed to that. Hated being accustomed to that. Teslin slumped too, on the point of falling over until Doman shifted his grip on a Ginan to steady the Aes Sedai with one hand. "Thank you," Teslin said after a moment, the words sounding dragged from her. "But I need no help." She used the side of the wagon to help her rise, though, her cold Aes Sedai gaze daring anyone to comment. "The blade did slide on her rib, and so did Miss her heart. All she does need now be rest and food." She had not delayed to grab a cloak, Matt realized. In one direction along the narrow street, a clutch of women in spangled cloaks was watching from in front of a green-striped tent, their gazes intent and focused. In the other, half a dozen men and women in white-striped coats and tight breeches, acrobats who performed on horseback, darted looks toward Teslin between putting their heads together to whisper. Too late to worry about someone recognizing an Aes Sedai's face. Too late to worry that one of them knew healing when he saw it done. The dice battered at the inside of Matt's head. They had not stopped. The game was not played out yet. "Who's looking for her, Julian?" he asked. "Julian!" The thief-catcher gave over glaring at Tuon and Solution, and murmuring to Thera, though he continued to pat the trembling woman. "Bannon and the Red Arms, Lopin and Naren. Oliver, too. He was away before I could catch him. But in this..." He stopped, soothing Thera long enough to gesture toward the main street. The babble of voices was clearly audible even at this distance. "All she needs is to lay hands on the fancy cloaks and she can slip out with the first folk to leave. If we try stopping every woman with her hood up, or even try looking inside, we'll have a riot on our hands. These people are touchy."
Disaster.
Luca moaned, wrapping his cloak around himself tightly. Littell put an arm around him. It must have been like being comforted by a leopard, but in any case, Luca did not look much comforted. "Burn me, why?" Matt growled. "Ren was always ready to lick my bloody wrist. I thought if anybody went over the edge." He did not even glance at Thera, but Julian still scowled at him darkly. Doman had stood up with the Ginan in his arms. She struggled feebly at first. The Ginan was not a woman to let herself be carried about like a doll. But eventually she seemed to realize that if she did make her own feet, she would fall over. She sagged against the Ileanor's chest with a resentful glower. Doman would learn, even when a woman needed help, if she did not want it, she made you pay for giving it. "I'm the only one who knew her secret," she drawled in a weak voice. "The only one who might give it away, at least. She may have thought it would be safe to go home, with me dead." "What secret?" Matt asked. The woman hesitated for some reason, frowning at Doman's chest. Finally she sighed. "Rena was leashed once. So were Bethaman and Sita. They can channel, or maybe learn to. I don't know. But the Idam worked on those three. Maybe it works on any Suldam." Matt whistled through his teeth. Now that would be a kick in the head for the Shanchan. Luca and his wife exchanged puzzled glances, plainly not understanding a word. Teslin's mouth hung open, Aes Sedai serenity washed away in shock. Solution made an angry sound, though, blue eyes blazing, a bundle of cloth from her back as she took a step toward Doman. A quick flash of Tuon's fingers stopped her in her tracks, though it was a quivering halt. Tuon's face was a dark mask, unreadable. She did not like what she had heard, though. Come to think, she had said she trained Damani. Oh, burn him. On top of everything else, he was going to marry a woman who could channel. The sound of horses' hooves announced Harnan and the other three Red Arms, coming along the narrow way between the tents and wagons at a quick trot. Their swords were belted down under their cloaks, Metwin with a dagger almost as long as a short sword to boot. Gorderon had his heavy crossbow hanging at his saddle, already drawn and latched. The crank at his belt would take a full minute to pull back the thick cord, but this way, all All he need do was place a bolt. Arnon carried a double-curved horsebow with a bristling quiver at his hip. Fergus was leading Pips. Arnon did not bother dismounting. Eyeing Tuon and Selucia suspiciously, and Luca and Littell with almost as much doubt, he leaned down from his saddle, the crude hawk tattoo sharp on his cheek. "Rena stole a horse, my lord," he said quietly. Rode down one of the horse handlers at the entrance getting out. Bannon's following her. He said she could reach Coromon sometime tonight. That's the way she's headed. She's moving a lot faster than the wagons did. But she's riding bareback. We can catch her with luck. He sounded as if that luck were a matter of fact. The men of the band trusted Matt Cawthon's luck more than he did himself. There did not seem to be any choices, really. The dice were still pounding in his head. There was still a chance they might fall his way. A small chance. Matt Cawthon's luck. "Get your people on the road as fast as they can pack up, Luca," he said, stepping up onto Pips. "Leave the wall and anything else you can't get onto the wagons fast. Just go."
Are you crazy? Luca spluttered. "If I try to chase those people out, I will have a riot. And they'll want their coin back."
Like the man would think of money with his neck stretched on the headsman's block. "Think what you'll have if 1,000 Shonchan find you here tomorrow." Matt's voice was as cold as he could make it. If he failed, the Shonchan would run Luca's show down in short order, however fast they flogged their horses. Luca knew it too, from the twist of his mouth, as if he had just bitten a rotting plum. Matt made himself ignore the man. The dice were drumming hard, but they had not stopped yet. "Julian, leave all the gold for Luca except one good purse." Maybe the man could bribe his way clear, once the Shonchan saw he did not have their daughter of the 9 bloody moons. "Gather everybody and ride out as soon as you can. Once you're out of sight of the town, take to the forest. I'll find you." "Everybody?" Sheltering Thera with his body, Julian jerked his head toward Tuon and Selucia. "Leave those two in Durador, and the Shonchan might stop with getting them back. It might slow them down, at least. You keep saying you're going to turn them loose sooner or later." Matt met Tuon's eyes. Big, dark, liquid eyes, a smooth, expressionless face. She had pushed her hood back a little, so he could see her face clearly. If he left her behind, then she could not say the words, or if she did, he would be too far away for the words to matter. If he left her behind, he would never learn why she smiled those mysterious smiles, or what lay behind the mystery. Right, he was a fool. Pips danced a few impatient steps. "Everybody," he said. Did Tuon nod slightly as if to herself? Why would she nod? "Let's ride," he told Arnon. They had to walk their horses through the crowds to get out of the show, but as soon as they reached the road, Matt put Pips to a gallop, cloak streaming behind, and head down to keep his hat from blowing off. It was not a pace he could keep a horse at for long. The road wound around hills and crossed ridges, occasionally cutting through where the rise was not too high. They splashed across ankle-deep streams and thundered over low wooden bridges crossing deeper water. Trees began to appear on the slopes again, pine and leatherleaf, showing green among the winter-bare branches of the others. Farms clung to some of the hills, low, tile-roofed stone houses and barns, a town and a hamlet of 8 or 10 houses. A few miles from the show, Matt spotted a wide man ahead of them, sitting his saddle like a sack of suet. The horse was a leggy dun, beating ground at a steady trot. He'd figured that a horse thief had an eye for a good animal. Catching the sound of their hooves, Bannon looked back, but he only slowed to a walk. That was bad. When Matt slowed Pips beside the dun, Bannon spat. "Best wager we got is we find her horse run to death so I can track her afoot from there," he muttered. "She's pushing harder than I figured with her bareback. If we push, we can maybe catch her by sunset. If her horse don't founder or die, that's about the time she'll make Coromon." Matt tipped back his head to glance at the sun almost straight overhead. It was a long way to cover in less than half a day. If he turned back, it could be a good distance the other side of Durador by sunset, in company with Tom and Julian and the others. With Tuon. With the Shonchan knowing to hunt Matt Cawthon. The man who had kidnapped the daughter of the 9 moons could not own enough luck to get off with being made Duck of Vale. And sometime tomorrow or the next day, they would plant Luca on an impaling stake. Luca and Littell, Petra and Clarine and the rest. A thicket of impaling stakes. The dice rattled and bounced in his head. "We can make it," he said. There was no other choice. Bannon spat. There was only one way to cover a great deal of ground quickly on a horse, if he meant to be on a live horse at the end. They walked the animals for half a mile, then trotted half a mile. The same at a canter, then a run, and it was back to a walk. The sun began to slide downward, and the dice spun. Around sparsely forested hills and over tree-topped ridges, streams that could be crossed in 3 strides, barely wetting the horses' hooves, and streams 30 paces across with flat ridges of wood or sometimes stone. The sun sank lower and lower, and the dice spun faster and faster. Almost back to the Eldar, and no sign of Brenna except scuffs on the hard dirt of the road that Bannon pointed to as if they were painted signs. Getting close now, the fat man muttered. He did not sound happy, though. Then they rounded a hill. There was another low bridge ahead. Beyond, the road twisted north to cross the next ridge through a saddle. The sun, sitting atop the ridge, blazed in their eyes. Gorman lay on the other side of that ridge. Pulling his hat lower for shade, Matt searched the road for a woman, for anyone, mounted or afoot, and his heart sank. Bannon cursed and pointed. A lathered bay was laboring its way up the slope on the other side of the river, a woman frantically kicking its flanks, urging it to climb. Brenna had been too anxious to reach the Shongshan to stick with the road. She was maybe 200 paces from them, and she might as well have been miles. Her mount was on the point of collapsing, but she could get down and run within the sight of the garrisons before they could reach her. All she had to do was reach the crest, another 50 feet. "My lord," Arnon said. He had an arrow nocked, and his bow half raised. Gorderon held the heavy crossbow to his shoulder, a thick pointed bolt in place. Matt felt something flicker and die inside him. He did not know what. Something. The dice rolled like thunder. "Shoot," he said. He wanted to close his eyes. The crossbow snapped. The bolt made a black streak in the air, and slammed forward when it hit her back. She had almost managed to push herself erect against the bay's neck when Harnon's arrow took her. Slowly, she toppled from the horse, sliding down the slope, rolling, bouncing off saplings, tumbling faster and faster until she splashed into the stream. For a moment, she floated face down against the bank, and then the current caught her and pulled her away, skirts billowing up on the water. Slowly, she drifted toward the Eldar. Maybe, eventually, she would reach the sea. And that made 3. It hardly seemed to matter that the dice had stopped. That made 3. Never again, he thought, as Renna floated out of sight around a bend. If I die for it, never again. They did not press, riding back eastward. There was no point, and Matt felt too bone-weary. They did not stop, though, except to breathe and water the horses. No one wanted to talk. It was the small hours of the night when they reached Jorador, the town a dark mass with the gates shut tight. Clouds covered the moon. Surprisingly, the canvas walls of Luca's show were still in place just beyond the town, with a pair of bulky men wrapped in blankets, snoring unaware beneath the big banner as they guarded the entrance. Even from the road, in the dark, it was plain that wagons and tents filled the space behind the wall. "At least I can tell Luca he doesn't have to run after all," Matt said wearily, turning Pips toward the banner. "Maybe he'll give us a place to sleep a few hours." For all the gold he had left, Luca should give him his own wagon, but knowing the man, Matt had hopes for clean straw somewhere. Tomorrow he would set out to find Tom and the others, and Tuon. Tomorrow, when he had rested. A greater shock waited inside Luca's huge wagon. It truly was roomy inside, at least for a wagon, with a narrow table sitting in the middle and space to walk around it. Table, cupboards, and shelves all were polished till they glowed. Tuon was sitting in a gilded chair. Luca would have a chair, and gilded, when everybody else made do with stools, with Selucia standing at her back. A beaming Luca was watching Littell offer Tuon a plate of steaming pastries, which the dark little woman was examining as if she would actually eat something that Luca's wife had cooked. Tuon showed no surprise at all at Matt walking into the wagon. "Is she captured or dead?" she said, picking up a pastry with her fingers curved in that curiously graceful way. "Dead," he said flatly. "Luca, what in the light?" "I forbid it, Toy," Tuon snapped, pointing a finger at him sharply. "I forbid you to mourn a traitor." Her voice softened slightly, but it remained firm. "She earned death by betraying the Empire, and she would have betrayed you as easily. She was trying to betray you. What you did was justice, and I name it so." Her tone said that if she named a thing, then it was well and truly named. Matt squeezed his eyes shut for a moment. Is everyone else still here too? He demanded.
Of course,
Lucas said, still smiling like a bull-goose fool.
the lady, the High Lady, forgive me, High Lady.
He bowed deeply.
She talked to Marilyn and Sandar, and, well, you see how it was. A very persuasive woman, the lady, the High Lady. Cawthon, about my gold. You said they were to hand it over, but Marilyn said he'd slit my throat first, and Sandar threatened to crack my head, and...
He trailed off under Matt's stare, then suddenly brightened again.
Look what the lady gave me.
Snatching open one of the cupboards, he pulled out a folded paper that he held reverently in both hands. It was thick paper and white as snow. Expensive.
A warrant. Not sealed, of course, but signed. Valen Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders is now under the personal protection of the High Lady Tuan Athayan Kora Payandrang. Everyone will know who that is, of course. I could go to Shanjan. I could put on my show for the Empress. May she live forever.
He added hastily, with another bow to Tuan. For nothing, Matt thought bleakly. He sank down on one of the beds with his elbows on his knees, earning a very pointed look from Littell. Likely only Tuan's presence kept her from clouding him. Tuan raised a peremptory hand, a black porcelain doll, but every inch a queen despite the shabby too-large dress. You are not to use that except at need, Master Luca. Great need.
Of course, High Lady, of course.
Luca bobbed bows as if he might be kissing the floorboards any minute. All for bloody nothing. I did make specific mention of who is not under my protection, Toy. Tuan took a bite of pastry and delicately brushed a crumb from her lip with a finger. Can you guess whose name heads that list? She smiled. Not a malicious smile. Another of those smiles for herself. Amusement or delight in something he could not see. Suddenly he noticed something. That little cluster of silk rosebuds he had given her was pinned to her shoulder. Despite himself, Matt began to laugh. He threw his hat down on the floor and laughed. With everything, all his efforts, he did not know this woman at all. Not a bit. He laughed until his ribs hurt.
Chapter 30. What the Oath Rod Can Do. The sun sat on the horizon, perfectly silhouetting the white tower in the distance, but the cold of the previous night seemed to be deeper.
Hey, Bastian, how you doing, bro?
Clouds marching across the sky.
Good to see you.
Winter was diminishing, yet it had clung past when spring should have begun. I
would do a dab on my rig,
the noises of morning penetrated
I'm
the
a little bit out, so I got
isolated as it was from everything around it. The camp seemed to vibrate. Laborers would be bringing in water from the wells and extra measures of firewood and charcoal in carts. Serving women would be fetching sisters' breakfasts, and novices in the second sitting scurrying to theirs, those in the first and third to classes. It was a momentous day, though none of them knew it.
Yeah,
today would see an end to the spurious negotiations that were going on in Darine.
Can't complain too much.
At a table under a pavilion at the foot of the bridge to Tarvalon. Spurious on both sides.
Trying to get the funds together now for another webcam so I can do my live streaming of my
meeting for some time. Peering at her own breakfast,
my diamond paint or my diamond art I do.
Out of the steaming porridge. I
had a little cheap one that I bought
to be sure that it
off of eBay, but
if you could not be sure, then you worried less about what remained in the bowl.
That one went out already on me.
And tried to concentrate on the sweet slivers of dried apricot.
Hell yeah.
Blended in. Did something crack under her teeth?
Then in a bigger town, you definitely make good money.
So pay it no mind, Chesa murmured as if talking to herself. That was how she gave Egwene advice, without straying across the line between mistress and maid. At least she gave advice when Halima was not present, and the other woman had left
I think
this morning.
In your area, someone rather call
an Uber and had to deal with the taxi service. An errand run. But now and then her eyes strayed to the pile of garments that were to go to the washwomen today. She never minded darning or mending in front of Egwene, but in her book, sorting laundry would have been stepping over that line. Smoothing the grimace from her face, Egwene was about to tell the woman to go and have her own breakfast. Chesa considered eating before Egwene finished another transgression. But before she could open her mouth, Nisao pushed into the tent, surrounded by the glow of Saidar. As the entry flaps fell, Egwene caught a glimpse of Saren, Nisao's bald, black-bearded stump of a warder, waiting outside. The small sister's cowl was down, carefully arranged on her shoulders so the yellow velvet lining showed, yet she was clutching her cloak as though she felt the cold intensely. She said nothing, just gave Chesa a sharp look. Chesa waited for Egwene's nod, gathered her own cloak, and scurried out. She might not be able to see the light of the power, but she knew when Egwene wanted privacy. Chiron Stang is dead, Nisao said without preamble. Her face was smooth, her voice steady and chill. Short enough to make Egwene feel tall, she stood as though straining for an
Hell
extra
yeah.
inch.
That's
Nisao
badass,
didn't usually
Basing.
do that. 7 sisters had already tested for resonance before I
They
got
should
there.
make good money doing
There
it
is no
that way.
doubt she was killed using Saidin. Her neck was broken, shattered, as if her head had been rolled around full circle. At least it was quick. Nisao drew a deep, unsteady breath, then realized what she had done and pulled herself up even straighter. Her warder is primed for murder. Someone gave him an herbal concoction to put him to sleep, but he will be trouble to handle once he wakes. She did not put the usual dismissive yellow twist on the mention of herbs, a measure of her upset, no matter how calm her face was. Egwene set her spoon down on the tiny table and leaned back. Suddenly her chair did not feel comfortable anymore. Now the next best after Lyanna was Boda Cawthon, a novice. She tried not to think of what else Boda was. With the extra days of practice, Boda could do the work almost as well as Chiron could have. Almost. She did not mention that, though. Nisao knew some secrets, but not all. Anaya and now Chiron, both Blue Aja. Do you know of any other link between them? Nisao shook her head. Anaya had been Aes Sedai 50 or 60 years when Chiron came to the tower, as I recall. Perhaps they had mutual acquaintances. I just don't know, Mother. Now she sounded tired, and her shoulders slumped a little. Her quiet investigation into Anaya's death had gotten nowhere, and she had to be aware Egwene was going to add Chiron. Find out, Egwene ordered, discreetly. This second murder would cause enough ruction without her adding to it. For a moment she studied the other woman. Nisao might make excuses after the fact, or claim she had been doubtful from the beginning, but until then she was always a model of yellow Aja self-assurance and absolute certainty. Not now, however. Are many sisters walking about holding Saidar? I've noticed several, Mother, Nisao said stiffly. Her chin rose within a fraction of defiance. After a moment, though, the glow around her winked out. She pulled her cloak tighter, as if she had suddenly lost warmth. I doubt it would have done Chiron any good. Her death was too sudden. But it makes a person feel safer.
Oh, damn.
After the small
That's some long
left,
evenings.
Egwene sat
Definitely be
her
careful,
palate with her
bro.
spoon. She did not see any more dark flecks.
A lot of crazy
Her
shit's
appetite was
happening
gone.
nowadays out there.
Finally, she rose and settled the 7-striped stole around her neck, then swung her cloak onto her shoulders. Today, of all days, she would not sit mired in gloom. Today, of all days, she must follow her routine exactly. Outside, high-wheeled carts trundled along the frozen ruts of the camp streets, filled with big water barrels or piles of split firewood and sacks of charcoal, the drivers and the fellows riding behind alike enveloped in their cloaks against the cold. As usual, families of novices hurried along the wooden walkways, usually managing to make their courtesies to passing Aes Sedai without slowing. Failure in the proper respects to a sister could earn a switching, but so could tardiness, and teachers were generally less tolerant than Aes Sedai encountered in passing, who at least might make allowances for why a novice went rushing by. The white-clad women still leapt out of the way at sight of the striped stole hanging from Egwene's cowl, of course, but she refused to let her mood be soured any more than it already was by novices curtsying in the street, slipping and sliding on the ice-hard ground, and sometimes almost falling on their faces before their cousins could grab them. Cousin was what members of the same family had taken to calling one another, and somehow that seemed to tie them closer together, as if they really were related, and close cousins at that. What did sour her mood were the few Aes Sedai she saw out and about, gliding along the walkways with of curtsies. There were no more than a dozen or so between her tent and the Amerlin's study, but 3 out of every 4 were wrapped in the light of the power as well as cloaks. They walked in pairs more often than not, followed by any warders they had. They seemed watchful, too, enveloped in side-arr or not, cowls swiveling constantly as they scanned everyone in sight. It minded her of the time spotted fever had struck and everyone walked around clutching brandy-soaked handkerchiefs to their noses. Dorrel Barron, the wisdom then, had said that would help stave it off, clutching their handkerchiefs and watching one another to see who would be the next to break out in spots and fall over. 11 people died before the fever ran its course, but it was a month after the last person fell sick before anyone was willing to put those handkerchiefs away. For a long time she had associated the smell of brandy with fear. She could almost smell it now. 2 sisters had been murdered in their midst by a man who could channel, not to mention apparently being able to come and go as he chose. Fear was running through the Aes Sedai faster than spotted fever ever could. The tent she used as a study was already warm when she arrived, the brazier giving off a scent of roses. The mirrored stand lamps and table lamp were lit. Her routine was well known. Hanging her cloak on the cloak rack in the corner, she took her seat behind the writing table, automatically catching the unsteady chair leg that always tried to fold. All she had to do was follow routine. Tomorrow she could announce what had been done. Her first visitor was a shock, perhaps the last woman she expected to walk into the tent. Theodrin was a willowy, apple-cheeked brown, a copper-skinned Damani with a stubborn set to her mouth. Once she had always looked ready to smile. She glided across the worn carpets, close enough for the fringe of her shawl to brush the writing table. As she made a very formal curtsy, Egwene extended her left hand so the woman could kiss her great serpent ring. Formality must be met with formality. "Romanda wishes to know if she can meet with you today, Mother," the slender brown said. Softly, but there was a stubbornness buried in her tone, too. "Tell her at any time she chooses, daughter," Egwene replied carefully. Theodrin offered another curtsy without changing expression. As Brown moved to leave, one of the accepted brushed by her into the tent, pushing back her banded white hood. Imara was a thin woman, and as small as Nisau. It seemed a strong wind might blow her away, yet she had a very firm hand with the novices given into her care, firmer than many sisters. But then she was hard on herself, and a novice's life was supposed to be hard. Imara's gray eyes rolled to the fringe on Theodrin's shawl, and her mouth twisted into a scornful grin before she smoothed it away to spread her snowy banded skirts for Egwene. Bright spots of color flamed on Theodrin's cheeks. Egwene slapped a hand down on the table hard enough to rattle the stone inkwell and the sand jar. "Have you forgotten how to be courteous to an Aes Sedai, child?" she said sharply. Imara went pale. The Amerlin did have a reputation, after all, and hastily made an even deeper curtsy for Theodrin, who acknowledged it with a wooden nod before gliding from the tent a good deal more swiftly than she had entered. What Imara stammered out, in an Ilianer accent made thicker by nerves, was a request from Lelaine to meet with the Amerlin. Romanda and Lelaine had been much less formal once, appearing unannounced and whenever they wished, but the declaration of war on Elida had changed a great deal. Not everything, but enough to go on with. Egwene returned the same reply to Lelaine that she had to Ramonda, though in a more clipped tone, and Imara almost fell over, making her curtsy, and practically ran out of the tent. One more nail fastening together the legend of Egwene Alvir, the Amerlin seat who made Sir Raylan Gunn look like a goose-down pillow. As soon as the accepted was gone, Egwene raised her hand and frowned at what it had covered. The folded square of paper that Theodrin had deposited on the table, while kissing her ring. Her frown deepened when she opened it. The script that covered the small page managed to flow while being precise, but there was an ink blot on one edge. Theodrin was very neat. Perhaps she was trying to conform to the general view of Browns. Ramonda has sent 2 sisters to travel to Cairhien and investigate some tale that has the yellow sitters buzzing. I don't know what the rumor is, Mother, but I will find out. I heard one of them mention Nynaeve, not as if she were in Cairhien, but as if the rumor was somehow connected to her. The fool woman had even signed her name. What is that, Mother? Egwene gave a start of surprise and barely caught the folding chair leg before it dropped her onto the carpets. She refocused her scowl on Swan, who stood just inside the entry flaps with her blue-fringed shawl on her arms and her leather folders pressed to her breasts. The blue-eyed woman's eyebrows raised slightly at Egwene's startlement. Here, Egwene said irritably, thrusting the paper at her. This was no time to be jumping and twitching. You know about Cairhien? Of course she must, but Egwene still said, Have you made the necessary changes? Necessary changes? Light. She sounded as pompous as Ramonda. She was on edge. Only at the last did she think to embrace Saidar and weave a ward against eavesdropping. Only after the ward was in place did she think that today might not be the best time for anyone to think she had private matters to discuss with Swan. Swan was not on edge. She had weathered storms, and managed to recover from drowning, some might say. Today was only a little windy to her. No need until we know for sure about the boats, Mother, she replied calmly, setting her folders on the table and neatly squaring them between the inkwell and the sand jar. The less time Boda has to think about it, the less chance she'll panic. Calm as a pond. Even 2 murdered sisters could not ruffle Swan, or sending a novice of only a few months to replace one of them. A frown creased her forehead as she read the note, though. First Faelane goes into hiding, she growled at the paper, and now Theodrin brings this to you instead of to me. That fool girl has less brains than a fisher bird. You'd think she wants someone to find out she's keeping an eye on Ramonda for you. Keeping an eye, a polite way of saying spy. They were both practiced in euphemisms. That went with being Aes Sedai. Today, euphemisms grated on Egwene. Perhaps she does want to be discovered. Perhaps she's tired of Ramonda telling her what to do, what to say, what to think. I had an accepted in here who sneered at Theodrin's shawl, Swan. The other woman made a dismissive gesture. Ramonda tries to tell everyone what to do, and what to think. As for the rest, things will change once Theodrin and Faelane can swear on the oath rod. I don't suppose anyone will actually insist they be tested for the shawl now. Until then, they just take what comes. That isn't good enough, Swan. Egwene managed to keep her tone level, but it took an effort. She had at least suspected what she was letting those 2 in for when she told them to attach themselves to Ramonda and Lelaine. She had needed to know what the sitters were scheming at, and still needed to know, yet she had a duty to them. They had been the first to swear fealty to her, and of their own free will. Besides which, much of what's said about Theodrin and Faelane can be said of me, too. If accepted can show them disrespect, well, she had no fear of that. The sisters were another matter, especially the sitters. Swan, I have no hope at all of uniting the tower if Aes Sedai doubt me. Swan snorted forcefully. Mother, by now even Lelaine and Ramonda know you're the Amerlin seat in truth, whether or not they'll admit it. That pair wouldn't have fallen in line with Diana Ahriman. I think they're beginning to see you as another Adarna nor a Govna. That's as may be. Egwene said dryly. Diana was considered the White Tower's savior after Bonwyn's disaster with Arthur Hawkwing. Edarna was believed to have been the most politically skilled woman ever to hold the staff and stole. Both had been very strong Amerlins. But as you've reminded me, I have to make sure I don't end up like Shane Chunla. Shane had begun as a strong Amerlin, firmly in charge of the tower and the hall, and ended as a puppet, doing exactly as she was told. Swan nodded in approval and agreement. She really was teaching Egwene the tower's history, and she often brought up Amerlins who had misstepped fatally, including herself. This is another matter, though, she muttered, tapping the note against her fingers. When I lay my hands on Theodrin, I'll make her wish she was a novice. And Faelane. If they think they can shirk off now, I swear I'll gut the pair of them like grunters on the dock. You'll gut who? Shiriam asked as she walked in through the ward in a gust of cold air. Egwene's chair almost dropped her onto the carpets again. She needed to get a chair that did not try to fold up every time she moved. She was willing to bet Edarna never jumped as if she had itch oak down her back. No one who concerns you, Swan said calmly, putting the paper to one of the table lamp's flames. It burned quickly, right to her fingertips, and then she mashed it out between her hands and brushed the ash away. Only Egwene, Swan, and Lyanna knew the truth of Faelane and Theodrin, and the two sisters themselves, of course, though there was a great deal neither of them knew either. Shiriam accepted the rebuff with equanimity. The fire-haired woman seemed to have recovered completely from her collapse in the hall. At least, she had recovered her outer dignity for the most part. Watching Swan burn the note, her tilted green eyes might have tightened a little, and she did touch the narrow blue stole hanging from her shoulders as if to remind herself that it was there. She did not have to accept Swan's orders. Putting her keeper in that position had seemed too harsh to Egwene in the end, but Shiriam knew very well that Swan had no need to accept her orders either, which had to gall her now that Swan stood so far beneath her in the power. Knowing there were secrets she was not privy to had to gall her as well. Shiriam would have to live with it, though. She also had brought a paper which she laid on the table in front of Egwene. I met Tiana on the way here, Mother, and told her I'd give this to you. This was the day's report on runaways, though those no longer came every day or even every week, since the novices had been organized into families. Cousins supported one another through frustrations and tears, and managed to talk one another out of the worst mistakes, like running away. There was only one name on the page, Nicola Treehill. Egwene sighed and set the paper down. She would have thought Nicola's greed for learning would have kept her feet still, no matter how frustrated the woman grew. And yet she could not say she was sorry to see the end of her. Nicola was conniving and unscrupulous, willing to try blackmail or whatever else she thought would advance her. Very likely she had had help. Arena would not have balked at stealing horses for the pair of them to flee. Abruptly, the date beside the name caught her eye. 2 dates, actually, marked as questions. Months were seldom named, much less days numbered, except in official documents and treaties. Signed, sealed, and witnessed in the city of Ilion on the 12th day of Savin, this year of grace. And for reports of this nature, and entering a woman's name in the novice book. For common use, so many days before this feast day or after that sufficed. Written out, dates always looked a little strange to her. She had to count on her fingers to be sure of what she saw. Nicola ran away 3 or 4 days ago, Shiriam, and Tiana is just reporting it? She isn't even sure whether it was 3 days or 4? Nicola's cousins covered for her mother. Shiriam shook her head ruefully. Strangely, her small smile seemed amused, though, or even admiring. Not from love. Apparently they were glad to see the child go and afraid she'd be brought back. She was quite overbearing about her talent at foretelling. I'm afraid Tiana is very upset with them. None will be sitting comfortably in their classes today, or for days to come, I fear. Tiana says she intends to give them each a dose of the strap instead of breakfast every day till Nicola is found. I think she might relent, though. With Nicola gone so long before her flight was discovered, it may be some time before she's located. Egwene winced slightly. She could recall her own visits to the study of the Mistress of Novices, then occupied by the very woman in front of her. Shiriam had a strong arm. A daily dose would be fierce. But hiding a runaway's flight was more serious than sneaking out after hours or pulling a prank. She pushed the report to one side. Tiana will handle it as she sees fit, she said. Shiriam, has there been any change in how the sisters talk about my dream? She had revealed the dream about a Shanshan attack the very morning after dreaming it, and the women she told stared at her apathetically, apparently because of the freshness of Anaya's death. That had stunned everyone. Instead of answering, Shiriam cleared her throat and smoothed her blue-slashed skirts. You may not be aware, Mother, but one of Nicola's cousins is Larina Ayelen, from Emmons Field, she added, as if Egwene did not know that. No one would think you were playing favorites if you pardoned the whole family. Whether or not she relents, Tiana does need to be very sharp with them in the meantime. They will suffer. Leaning back, carefully because of the wobbly chair leg, Egwene frowned up at the other woman. Larina was almost the same age as she, and a close friend growing up. They had spent hours together, gossiping and practicing putting their hair in braids for when the women's circle said they were old enough. Despite that, Larina had been one of the few Emmonsfield girls who seemed to accept that Egwene might really be the Amelin seat, though she showed it mainly by keeping her distance. But did Shiriam think Egwene would play favorites? Even Swan looked taken aback. You should know better than anyone, Shiriam. Novice discipline is the province of the Mistress of Novices. Unless a girl is being abused, anyway, and you haven't suggested that. Besides, if Larina thinks she can get away with helping a runaway today, helping a runaway, Shiriam, what will she think she can get away with tomorrow? She can reach the shawl, if she has the gumption to stick with it. I won't lead her down a path that ends with her being sent away for misbehavior. Now, what are they saying about my dream? Shiriam's tilted green eyes blinked, and she glanced at Swan. Light. The woman thought Egwene was being hard because Swan was present, because Swan might carry tales. She should know better. She had been the Mistress of Novices. The attitude among the sisters' mother, Shiriam said finally, is still that the Shanshan are 1,000 miles away, they don't know how to travel, and if they start marching on Tarbalin, we'll learn of it before they're within 200 leagues. Swan muttered something under her breath that sounded vile, but not surprised. Egwene wanted to curse, too. Worries over Anaya's murder had had nothing to do with the sisters' apathy. They did not believe that Egwene was a dreamer. Anaya had been sure, but Anaya was dead. Swan and Lyanna believed, yet neither stood high enough now to be listened to with more than impatient politeness, if that. And it was quite clear that Shiriam did not believe. She obeyed her oath of fealty as scrupulously as Egwene could have wished for, but you could not order someone to believe. They only mouthed what you told them, and nothing changed. When Shiriam left, Egwene found herself wondering what had brought the woman in the first place. Could it have been just to point out that Larina was going to be punished? Surely not. But she had said nothing else, apart from answering Egwene's questions. Shortly, Mirel arrived, followed closely by Morvran. Egwene could feel each of them release the source before she entered the tent, and they left their warders waiting outside. Even in brief glimpses as the entry flaps were pushed aside, the men looked wary, even for warders. Mirel's big dark eyes flashed at the sight of Swan, and her nostrils flared. Morvran's round face remained smooth as polished stone, but she brushed her dark brown skirts with both hands, as if wiping something off. Perhaps it was unconscious. Unlike Shiriam, they did have to accept Swan's orders, and neither liked that at all. It was not that Egwene wanted to grind their noses, but she trusted Swan. And oaths or no oaths, she did not entirely trust them. Not to the degree she did Swan. Besides, there were times it was inconvenient, if not impossible, for her to tell the sisters sworn to her what she wanted done. Swan could carry messages, and this way Egwene could be sure they were obeyed. She asked about talk of her dreams straight away, but unsurprisingly their stories were the same as Shirion's. The Shanshan were far off. There would be plenty of warning should that change. The story had been the same for a good week and a half. Worse. It might be different if Anaya were alive, Morgren said, balancing atop one of the rickety stools in front of the writing table. In spite of her bulk, she did it easily and gracefully. Anaya had a reputation for arcane knowledge. I always thought she should have chosen Brown myself. If she said you were a dreamer, her teeth clicked shut at a sharp look from Egwene. Mirelle suddenly took an interest in warming her hands at the brazier. Neither of them believed either. Except for Swan and Lyanna, no one in the whole camp believed that Egwene had had a true dream. Varolin had taken over the talks in Garain, deftly pushing Banin into a lesser role, and she offered constant excuses as to why she could not pass on a warning at just this moment. Perhaps in a few days, when the talks were going more smoothly. As if they were ever anything other than sisters talking in circles, without saying a word that might send the other side away offended. No one at all but Swan and Lyanna, she thought they believed. Mirelle turned from the brazier as if steeling herself to put a hand on the coals. Mother, I have been thinking about the day Shadar Logoth was destroyed. She broke off and turned back to the brazier as a long-faced woman in deep blue entered the tent, carrying a three-legged stool painted in bright spirals. Maigan was beautiful, with large eyes and full lips, but she seemed elongated somehow. She was not that tall, but even her hands seemed long. She gave Morvern a cool nod and pointedly ignored Mirelle. I brought my own seat today, Mother, she said, making as much of a curtsy as she could with the stool in one hand. Yours are rather unsteady, if I may say so. It had come as no surprise that Anaya's death meant the Blue Adja would name someone else to Egwene's advisory council, but she had hoped for the best when she learned who it was to be. Maigan had been one of Swan's allies when Swan was Amelin. Do you mind if I send Swan for tea, Mother? Maigan said as she settled onto her stool. You really should have a novice or accepted to run errands, but Swan will do. The novices have their classes, daughter, Egwene replied, and even with the arrangement of families, the accepted hardly have time for their own studies. Besides which, she would have to send a novice or accepted to stand in the cold any time she wanted to speak to someone in privacy. Hard on one who would not yet have been taught how to ignore heat or cold, and a flag planted outside the tent telling everyone there might be something worth eavesdropping on.
Hey, big movie fan, how you
Swan,
doing?
will you please bring us some tea? I'm sure we could all do with a hot cup. Maigan
Hope you're
raised a
doing well,
long-fingered
bro.
hand as Swan started for the entrance. I have a jar of mint honey in my tent, she said imperiously. Fetch that, and mind you don't filch any. I remember you used to have a sweet tooth. Hurry now. Maigan had been an ally. Now she was one of many sisters who blamed Swan for breaking the White Tower. As you say, Maigan, Swan replied in a meek voice, and even bent her knee slightly before she hurried out. And she did hurry. Maigan stood as high as Mirelle or Morvern, and there were no orders or oaths of fealty to protect her here. The long-faced woman gave a small, satisfied nod. Swan had had to beg to be accepted.
Oh, it's all
back
good,
into the
big movie
Blue
fan.
Adja,
Thanks
and
for
rumor
stopping
had it
by.
that Maigan had been the most insistent on the begging. Morvern made her excuses to leave behind Swan, perhaps meaning to catch her up for some reason, but Mirelle took one of the stools and engaged in a competition with Maigan. Who could ignore the other most completely? Egwene did not understand the animosity between the two women. Sometimes people just disliked one another. In any case, it did not make for conversation. Egwene took the opportunity to leaf through the pages in Swan's folders, but she could not concentrate on rumors out of Ilion and innuendos out of Cairhien. There seemed nothing to account for Theodrin's claim of a tale that had set the yellow sitters buzzing.
Hell yeah,
would
bro.
have said something
Appreciate it.
if she had known. Mygon and Mirel stared at her as if watching her turn over sheets of paper was the most interesting activity in the world. She would have sent them both away, but she wanted to find out what Mirel had been thinking about the day Shadar Logoth had been scooped out of the earth. She could not send one away without sending both. Drat the pair of them. When Swan returned with a wooden tray holding a silver teapot and porcelain cups, and Mygon's white glazed honey jar, she was followed into the tent by a soldier in plate and mail armor, a young Shinaran with his hair shaved off except for a topknot. Young, but not young. Ragan's dark cheek carried a puckered white scar from an arrow, and his face was hard, in the way only the face of a man who lived with death every hour could be hard. As Swan distributed teacups, he bowed, one hand holding a moon-crested helmet on his hip, the other on his sword hilt. Nothing in his expression said he had ever met her before. "Honor to serve, mother," he said formally. "Lord Bryn sent me. He said to tell you that it seems the raiders may have crossed to this side of the river last night, with Aes Sedai. Lord Bryn is
I'll have to check it out here in a second.
He advises that sisters stay close to the camp, to avoid incidents." "May I be excused, mother?" Swan said suddenly, with the slightly abashed sound of a woman who found herself with an urgent need for the jakes. "Yes, yes," Egwene said, as impatiently as she could manage, and barely waited for the other woman to dash out of the tent before going on. "Tell Lord Bryn that Aes Sedai go where they wish, when they wish." She snapped her mouth shut before she could call him Ragan, but that only served to make her seem severe. She hoped it did. "I will tell him, mother," he replied, making another bow. "Heart and soul to serve." Mygon smiled faintly as he departed. She deprecated soldiers. Warders were good and necessary. Soldiers made messes for others to clean up, in her opinion. But she did favor anything that seemed to indicate a wedge between Egwene and Gareth Bryn. Or perhaps better to say that Lilane favored. In this, Mygon was Lilane's woman to her toenails. Mirel merely looked puzzled. She knew that Egwene got on well with Lord Gareth.
Hell yeah, appreciate it, big
Egwene got up and poured herself a cup of tea, and took a touch of Mygon's honey. Her hands were quite steady. The boots were in place. In a few hours, Lyanna would gather Boda and ride well away from the camp before explaining what they were going to do. Larina must take the punishment she had earned, and Boda must do what needed doing. Egwene had been younger than Boda when she was set to hunt Black Sisters. Shinaran served their war against the Shadow and the Blight heart and soul. Aes Sedai and those who would become Aes Sedai served the Tower, a stronger weapon against the Shadow than any sword, and no less sharp to an unwary hand. When Romanda arrived, with Theodrin to hold open the entry flap for her, the gray-haired Yellow made a very exact curtsy, neither a fraction more nor less than propriety required from sitter to Amyrlin. They were not in the hall now. If the Amyrlin was only first among equals there, she was a little more in her own study, even for Romanda. She did not offer to kiss Egwene's ring, though. There were limits. She eyed Mirel and Mygon as if thinking of asking them to leave, or perhaps telling them. It was a prickly point. Sitters expected obedience, but neither was of her Aja, and this was the Amyrlin's study. In the end, she did neither, merely allowed Theodrin to take her cloak, embroidered with borders of yellow flowers, and pour her a cup of tea. Theodrin did not have to be asked to do either, and she retreated to a corner, twitching her shawl and her mouth set sullenly as Romanda took the empty stool. Despite the stool's uneven legs, Romanda managed to make it seem a seat in the hall of the tower, or maybe a throne, as she adjusted the yellow-fringed shawl she had worn beneath her cloak. "The talks are going badly," she said in that high musical voice. She still made it sound a proclamation. "Varylin is chewing her lips in frustration. Magla is frustrated too, for that matter, and even Soroya." When Saroya starts grinding her teeth, most sisters would be shouting. Excepting Janya, every sitter who had held a chair before the tower divided had insinuated herself into the negotiations. They were talking with women they had known in the hall back then, after all. Bayanin was nearly reduced to running errands. Romanda touched the tea to her lips, then held the cup out to one side on its dish without saying a word. Theodrin darted from the corner to take the cup over to the tray, adding honey before she returned the cup to the sitter and herself to the corner. Romanda tasted the tea again and nodded in approval. Theodrin's face colored. The talks will go as they go, Egwene said carefully. Romanda had opposed any sort of negotiations, spurious or not, and she knew what was to happen tonight. Keeping the hall in the dark about that had seemed a needless slap in the face. The tight bun on the back of Romanda's head bobbed as she nodded. They have shown us one thing already. Elida won't allow the sitters speaking for her to budge an inch. She is dug into the tower like a rat in a wall. The only way to flush her is to send ferrets in after her. Mirelle made a sound in her throat, earning a surprised.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. Excuse me. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.